morning everyone, welcome to the EduSat Network. Today's lecture will focus upon 20th century poetry with special reference to poets such as Auden, Yeats and Eliot. Through these poets, the subject expert will articulate the typical literary responses to the 20th century period. And for discussion on the same, we have with us Dr. Anand Prakash, retired professor, University of Delhi. We welcome you, sir.
Thanks, Urushi. You already announced the topic and the poets I'll be talking about. First, I say that all of us are products of the 20th century. Both the speakers here and the viewers, because our background is the 20th century, and that century was maybe arguably, I say, very eventful, and particularly eventful for two reasons. Maybe earlier also I referred to this in another discussion. There was the First World War in the second decade of the 20th century. It started in 1914 and it went up to 1917, when it left behind it, as it finished, a great deal of destruction, dismay, disappointment, shattered dreams, etc. And then in another 25 years, another war started, and that was much more destructive than the first. One can see, the kind of holocaust that occurred in one or two communities and societies in Europe before the onset of the Second World War, and then during the Second World War, which ended with the explosion of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that kind of destruction the world saw for the first time. So these two events have left their mark and their imprint on the lives and the psyche of the Europeans in general and the world, people of the world, in Europeans in particular, and the people of the world in general. Since both the wars, the First World War and the Second World War, happened in the European part of the world, and since we are also dealing with European literature generally, broadly, and English literature in particular, therefore, again and again, one has to think of these wars to understand the writing which it affected, these affected, and which once again bore the marks of influence on it. It is also interesting that as we talk about the 20th century poetry that was written in England, at the same time, at the receiving end of British colonialism, English colonialism, was the country to which we belong, India. And in India, there was a tradition of poetry, prose, drama, etc. in the early 20th century. And naturally, one compares what was written in England in the 20th century with what was written in India. So maybe this reference will remain constant in our mind as we talk about the poetry written in the 20th century England. I start with the poet W.B. Yeats, who is a major English poet of the 20th century, in fact, who started writing in the 19th century itself. If we think of the 20th century poets specifically, then we can say that he's one of the senior most poets of the 20th century literature. And secondly, this person did not directly belong to England per se. He belonged to Ireland, which always has been the target of exploitation, target of suppression and oppression by England. So therefore, his voice is somewhat different from the voices, poetic voices of the 20th century English poets. For instance, one sees a great deal of nationalism in him. He talks from the point of view of Irish nationalism, and since a kind of struggle against England was going on at the political level in Ireland at that time, W.B. Yeats could not remain untouched by it. In fact, he was associated with those people who were direct participants in the struggle against British oppression at that time. One has to refer to that lady whom W.B. Yeats loved and worshipped, Maud Gonne, who was a recognized leader of the Irish national movement in the latter half of the 19th century and in the first quarter of the 20th century. So this nationalism preoccupied. It was a point of engagement for W.B. Yeats all across his poetry. And Irish nationalism, one aspect of it is that it was resisting British oppression, and the other was that it was exploring its own history. So there have to be, Irish legends, Irish tales, Irish myths, Irish set of values which were specific to Ireland. And W.B. Yeats wanted to, recognize in clear terms his cultural roots by going back to those tales and myths. And when he wrote poetry, then he had at the back of his mind these Irish myths and the Irish, references of Romanticism. Since Ireland was not as developed industrially and socially as England, therefore it looked towards its past as a point of glory. It did not live in the present. Ireland lived in the past. And the poet coming from Ireland would also then live in the world of imagination, where he created the sense of the Irish past. And along with the myths that he talks about, there are certain things which go beyond the myths, because myths is an area which can't be scientifically examined and understood, and where you don't have written literature as much as the oral literature. And oral literature is very fertile in terms of communicating things which refer to the past as well as to the present. Therefore, in his poetry, you have this element of what is called romance, because he is romancing about the Irish past, and this romance is the backbone of his early poetry in particular. And there it also talks about magic, things which cannot be explained in rational terms. They have to be evoked in poetry through magic. In fact, how does one write a poem? How does one explore things poetically? How does one deal with the domain of the mind, etc.? All these refer to some element of magic, because words occur in the mind. One doesn't know in what pattern, in what sequence, and how they shape the mind of the person. All this is the domain of wonder. Therefore, W.B. Yeats was talking about magic and about romance all the time in his poetry, particularly in the first half, in the beginning years of his poetry writing. Then came the First World War, and then all the earlier values, all the earlier norms, etc., they were topsy-turvy. And W.B. Yeats then would think about destruction, not merely in Irish terms but also in European terms. And one finds that there is very little sense of satisfaction or contentment in his poetry, particularly in the middle years, because then he's all the time haunted by fears of destruction, fears of losing grip on one's present. And in fact, in one or two poems of his, he's talking about that destruction, which will come maybe in partly religious terms, that Christ will revisit the world now in the 20th century in a different form, through a different figure. And that figure would be the figure of Sphinx, which is cruel, which looks totally detached, the violence in whose eyes is very disturbing. And then he will say that maybe through this destruction, regeneration will happen. So this is also a kind of a myth, that when things become too hot for people to handle, then finally it begins the phase of destruction, and out of that destruction emerges another reality which is new, which is refreshing, and where things have been cleansed. So these are the things that he generally discusses in his poetry. And the poetry in a way is maturing, because now that old romance has been replaced by a new sense of realism, which has something to do with the First World War. First the building up of the war, then the actual happenings in the war, and then the aftermath of war. So these things, in a way, one can say that even when he is not directly talking about certain political happenings, which he sometimes does, he is having the pressure of the events of his time on his nerves, and these pressures get reflected in his poetry a great deal. For instance, he talks about the old values coming to an end so far as their appealing power is concerned. Now, new values will have to be created. How for a poet to create new values is the question that he constantly faces at this time. And there is a poem written in the middle years of his life called "A Prayer for My Daughter," the famous poem that it is in the courts of all the classes, particularly MA and post-MA, syllabi. And there, in this poem, he talks about his daughter in terms that are rather conservative. He doesn't want her to be very, very attractive. He doesn't want her to be very flashy. He doesn't want her to be very genius-like, very, very, very bright, but a simple, sober girl, and a person who would represent, the maturer, femininity and womanhood of the society at large. And he says that it is this kind of stance of a woman, of a young woman who will finally mature, would have maturer years, that finally these things will sustain life much more successfully than the dazzling outlook or the dazzling looks of a young woman. And maybe he has at the back of his mind his fascination for Maud Gonne, who partly would not respond to the advances of the poet when he was young, because she found herself too good for him, and she would give her attention more to the social change than to personal relationships. Whereas he would swear by personal relationships more than the social struggle which happened in the early years of his life in Ireland, and which was happening at different levels even at the time when he wrote these poems. So, so far as Yeats is concerned, the terms of maturity are the terms of looking back to that past when things were not as fast moving as they became in the 20th century. So I would call him a romantic at heart, because romanticism generally looks towards the past for inspiration and appeal, and since that inspiration is becoming weak, therefore that leaves the person sad and disturbed, and generally W.B. Yeats is sad and disturbed in the middle years of his poetry writing. Then with maturity, he also looks towards the arts in general, because life is not that way worth accepting in totality, and there are certain aspects of thinking and imagining which are enshrined in art much better than in the happenings of life. So he will derive appeal from the arts at that time. There's a poem about Byzantium, where art objects are that way very glittering, and where they talk about they represent what is called certain permanent features and values of life, and he would say that this art finally will keep us stuck to the sense of permanence in life. So he is in a way seeking permanence in art and in life, and since he cannot find much in life at that time, therefore he would think of the art objects of the ancient world. So imagine that he talks about earlier he talked about tales, then he talked about sadness and a disturbed state of mind, and finally he found answers in maturity, in norms which were somewhat conservative in their appearance, and then in the values which will sustain us. It will not be the outer superficial aspects of behavior that would impress him in the early years of the 20th century, in the first, second decades, and when he would refer to the art objects much more than than to the superficial expressions of human experience in literature and in the modern arts. Finally, W.B. Yeats would refer to certain happenings in an individual's life. This individual is not W.B. Yeats himself. He is talking about the individuals in the early 20th century who are sad and who are compelled to remain disturbed, who will always look for certain answers, and if they don't find them, then they will express their disquiet in the world of literature. And I would say that since he wants to retain his humanity, he wants to retain his interest in society of the time, and since that interest is slackening, is weakening in his poetry and in the world surrounding him, therefore he remains somewhat nonplussed. Now this aspect of being disturbed in the present conditions as a human being can be called a kind of humanism in him, which is flickering for the last time, because World War First that put paid to that very clearly rejected all that was nice, sweet, and glorious in life, and where things were being destroyed all around with a kind of recklessness and cynicism unheard of and unprecedented. So at this time, I would call him a humanist poet, a poet of humanist concerns, who wants to fulfill himself as a human being, and he's being impinged on at the level of mind, at the level of imagination, by forces which are beyond his control. So I would say this, and there are 3 or 4 things I have said about him. First, that he's a voice of Irish nationalism, and he's a romantic poet. Secondly, he's a poet with a kind of sadness, which is indicative of the pressures of the contemporary life. Thirdly, that his answers are the answers of maturity and somewhat sustaining norms, which appear to us a bit conservative. And finally, that he's a voice of humanism. And this romanticism which is weakening more and more, is the mainstay of his writing. Now, before I go further to Eliot, I would like to ask Urvashi, you, regarding what you think about romanticism. How do you understand the term romanticism in the 20th century, if you have something to say?
Just as you said, there's a lot of emphasis on humanism, that the human is an important figure, and he's not to be rejected or shunned away. And similarly, as Yeats is paying a lot of emphasis even to the sadness of people around him.
Well, yes, I couldn't agree with you more, because this is what romanticism is supposed to be. Romanticism is an expression of humanism, is an expression of that humanity which takes appeal from, which takes inspiration from ideals, and which takes from things that have not been attained with, but which can be attained. So therefore, unless human beings are romantic in their outlook, they cannot really look forward to the future. So this is the kind of thing that Yeats represents here, and you have rightly pointed this out. And I wanted you to say this because the next poet whom I'm going to deal with, T.S. Eliot, is a poet who calls himself an anti-romantic voice. So if he's anti-romantic, then you'll have to agree with me that he's that much less of a humanist, that much believing in something which human beings generally don't believe in. So so in a way, this makes us all critical of the kind of outlook that T.S. Eliot at the same time, maybe a little later than W.B. Yeats, but more or less at the same time, because they were contemporaries, that T.S. Eliot would be talking about not romanticism, but entirely critical of romanticism, and he will have an alternative path to tread. So I start with T.S. Eliot, referring to his anti-romanticism. And in fact, if Eliot were to write the history of English literature, then he would totally wipe out the Romantic age from the pages of his history, and he would and not only that, he would also remove to a great extent, even the writings of within quotes romantic idealist, humanist visionaries such as Shakespeare, and he would in fact go beyond the Renaissance period, which he would not set much store by, and he would perhaps go to medieval kind of writing, which always accepted something above it, which would guide and which would control the human literary and imaginative affairs. So this is what he was exploring, and this is what he was also projecting in his writing at that point of time. So I start by saying that so far as T.S. Eliot is concerned, he strikes a different chord than the one W.B. Yeats did, and therefore let's see his particularity, his specificity of response in the early years of the 20th century. Eliot, unlike many others, contemporaries of his, does not accept history as such. In fact, the word history is a bad word for him. If he has to talk about history, then he'll talk about time. And of course, much later, maybe in the late 20s and early 30s, he will write a poem which is in 4 parts and which is called 4 quartets. So there we'll talk about time. And then he will talk about contemporaneity. These are the concepts, that he'll be driven by. That either things are there today, or they are back in time, somewhat earlier. But there is a kind of a tradition which always remains with us, even though it belongs to the past. So the sense of past is not there as history. That there is a kind of movement from the past towards the present, and that this movement is somewhat linear, and that what we are today are not what we have been earlier. So it is a kind of a circular relationship between something that happened earlier in time and that happens today. So he offers an alternative view of history. In fact, he doesn't call it history. He doesn't believe as much in human civilization, because human civilization for him is getting away from some of the permanent aspects of existence in this world, and that existence may or may not be human existence. In fact, he in the second decade of the 20th century, he's going more into anthropology than into history. And for the person who has the anthropological dimension, would not much bother about what happened yesterday and what happened today, because there is a kind of a negation of history in anthropology. Things happen more clear in terms of nature than in terms of time in society. Thirdly, after rejecting history and civilization, he will also reject what is called progress. That human beings don't become better. Human beings are not better equipped than before, and that in fact they are losing out most of the time as they come to a present which is by definition worse than before. So this is the kind of outlook that he presents in his writing, and he also expresses it directly in his critical essays. I'll take them up in some other discussion later. Then when he has to become positive in his assertions, then he will use the word classicist, which in theory, which in literary criticism is always the opposite of the antonym of romanticism. So either one is a romanticist, either one is a romantic, or one is a classicist. So he calls himself a classicist in literature, which means that he doesn't bother about his personal opinion, about his ego, about his perspective. And in fact, in one of his essays that he wrote around the same time when he is writing this kind of poetry, when he talked about extinction of personality, he doesn't want his personality to come into the open in the work of art that he's creating. And he would say, the less impersonal, the less personal I am, the better I'm able to convey the reality surrounding me through myself. So this kind of a philosophy, this kind of point of view, he's projecting in his writing, and he's also practicing it in his poetry. And finally, that he doesn't give much value even to human experience. In fact, I'll refer to this particular poem, The Wasteland, that he wrote around this time in the second decade of the 20th century. or thereabout. There he says, that since the whole world, with its past and its present, is living in a state of contemporaneity. So, for instance, Cleopatra of Shakespeare actually coexists with a young woman of the 20th century. So, they are two good-looking women, and whether it's Cleopatra or a modern person doesn't make any difference. So, that way he doesn't see any movement from the past to the present, and the two, so far as the quality of the living is concerned, are not also different. So, Cleopatra could be an ordinary woman, and an ordinary woman could be just like Cleopatra and as scandalous. In fact, he has this idea of sinfulness much more than the idea of actually living life. So, since he is a classicist, so he keeps himself always away from the experience in literature, and he looks at it critically all the time. Therefore, human beings remain human beings, and in fact they degenerate into something worse than they were before. Therefore, he will not have any hope in human experience, in human expression, in human predicament, and he calls people all the time moving on the road to decline, the road where more and more degeneration is occurring with the passage of time. This is what he is showing in The Wasteland also. In fact, the poem, which is more than 400 lines, and it is called a modern classic. Initially, the poem was more than 1,000 lines, but then his literary guru and his mentor, Ezra Pound, was given this poem for editing, and he edited out about 800 lines, and he said that now it's a perfect poem. So, Eliot, for a long time, around the time of his death, I think after his death, the other version also was dug out. That's a long story, but I would merely say that being a classicist, he always gave value to editing things, making them more perfect, taking them away from the personal and the present day experience, so that it became value neutral. It became objective, kind of a medium through which historical or humanist or whatever human life's flow would take place. So, Wasteland, and then the other poem that comes to mind in this context, I have already referred to it, is Four Quartets, where he is talking about a still abstract plan of time, the way we are witness to in our own lives. And there he is talking about philosophical dimensions, and particularly the appearance and reality, and the possibility of something being there, and that possibility is hiding within itself the impossibility also. So, he is going into these philosophical questions in his poetry. But what impresses me about T.S. Eliot is that he is able to, he is intellectually equipped to offer a counterpoint to modern civilization, and his answers are that we have to go back beyond the Renaissance to the medieval period, when human individuality was not the question. Human individuality was not the issue. When there was a kind of order in the world, and that order had its center somewhere in godliness, somewhere in religion. So, all of us at that point of time were placed in the framework of religion, and we judged ourselves from within that framework, and we knew our place, we had our place. It was secondary to the religious, the godly, and the divine pattern. So, this is his basic premise, and from that angle he finds that the world is moving towards its doom and its destruction inexorably. How does one relate this kind of a point of view with the First World War that he saw with naked eyes in front of him, and where he found that all values of the 19th century, all romantic values, all humanism, etc., were questioned by the developments of the First World War? This is a question that I raise, and viewers, all of us should try to find out whether there is some connection between these questions and the First World War, or whether he was talking about the primitive world, or the world of anthropological time, or the medieval period, when God above was fixed and was looking at us critically, and we were supposed to be nice, controlled, regulated, disciplined human beings. So, this is the question, and once again, Urvashi, I ask you whether this kind of a view could have something to do with the First World War, which you saw from close quarters.
So this is what also I was thinking, that perhaps this feeling of disillusionment and thinking that everything is going to doom is resulting from World War I and its after effects and the destruction and the kind of situation it created in the society. So perhaps when he wrote The Wasteland, he was talking about the disillusionment and how the society suffered.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be that way?
I think so, yes, that's the question. And secondly, the other question that occurs is whether the reality unleashed by the First World War could be understood with the faculty of reason or not. He had his doubts.
Yes.
He thought, reason could not help us.
Yes.
So one doesn't know what would help, to understand that thing. He faced the reality of the First World War directly, and he would not allow the faculty of reason to intervene there, to temper it and to change it, because faculty of reason would be the human faculty, and human faculty would by definition violate the sanctity and the purity of the actual situation. So would you agree with this?
Sir, yes, I would agree with you, and that is probably why he also became a classicist, as you were telling us. Mm-hmm. And he probably became anti a lot of things that he should not have become.
That's quite true. And there's one more thing that occurs to me in this context, and that is, that at the end of the First World War, which is 1917, I referred to it in another discussion, emerged a country which represented the faculty of human reason, which represented the faculty, which represented the aspect of progress, which represent the equality of all human beings in a social system where people lived and planned the way they liked. I'm referring to socialist Russia at that time, the Soviet Union, which emerged exactly at the same time that the European world was shaken by the First World War. And this was the dream of the Romantics in the 19th century, that there has to be a world in which everybody is equal, where people, are not restrained by or are not, controlled by certain outer forces, and when they will take, things in their own hands, and they will develop them according to their needs and requirements. So this particular development of the emergence of Soviet Russia on the political social horizon in the world, this might have disturbed these people no end in Europe, because the European intellectual, the European upper middle class at that point of time felt very deeply threatened by the emergence of Russia, because many of the facilities and privileges that they were enjoying might be snatched from them by the common people who would be described as riffraff, as the uncivilized brutes by the rest of the people. And therefore this sense of insecurity in the minds of the upper sections in European society, this insecurity turned into a kind of a gloomy situation where there would be only a wasteland for them to witness. There wouldn't be a glorious world. I'll develop this point further, but I want your reaction to this, that it might have happened because a kind of answer was seen at that time by Europe, and that answer came not from Europe itself, but that part of the world which was on the fringes of Europe and which was more towards Asia than towards Europe. So what do you say to this?
Absolutely, sir. As you mentioned that the Europeans felt very threatened by emergence of a world which is Soviet Union, which is dealing with an aspect of progress. Absolutely. And Eliot had been living in London, and he was from America, and so perhaps he felt doubly threatened because he had already made a move to another world. And I think that you're also referring to India. How
Yes.
India would react to the whole situation. So
Yes, one can, your pointer is very clear, very correct also, that India in the 1920s and England in the 1920s were two different things altogether. Yes. They would not relate except as contradictions. And India was full of enthusiasm. India was full of the sense of struggling against all that they considered evil and all. India was in favor of a rational analysis of things. India was in favor of humanism, and India existed at the same time as England in the aftermath of the First World War. So one country goes down, the other country comes up, and the country that goes down has citizens, civilized, educated citizens, who think that the doom has occurred. Actually, the doom has not occurred. It's that another paradigm has emerged, and that paradigm is a glorious paradigm. So this is how the world comes out in its complexity through the analysis of European poetry at that time, which is full of gloom. And T.S. Eliot expresses this gloom to a large extent, and that maybe that gives one kind of picture of humanity, and Indian literature gives another and a contrasting picture of humanity at the same time. India, which is full of anger. Europe is not full of anger. Europe is full of dismay, of despair, and India at that point of time is full of the sense of change, the dynamic desire to turn things upside down and restore a kind of balance that is finally humanist in its proportions. So this is how one understands Eliot's poetry. It is more faith-centered. It's anti-romantic. It's classicist in nature, and it is informed by despair, and it doesn't talk about the concrete reality of the period. Then I'll just make one brief comment about Eliot, and then I'll shift to Auden and others of his time. That Eliot was also bringing his poetry close to the writing of drama. This trend was there in Shakespeare's time, and this finally, the two genres, drama and poetry, went in two different directions, with the result, that in the 18th century, drama is in prose and poetry is totally in a different form. In the 19th century, the same thing happens, but in the 20th century, around this time, Eliot brings back the verse, the poetic form to drama, and he writes a play where drama represents the poetic intensity and concentration with the kind of prose that he is able to present. And that drama that he wrote, it was written in 1930, 10 years after these poems that we have discussed were written. And here, he's using poetry to great effect. This poetry is not as rhymed and as metered as his poems were, but then the concept, the understanding was that things will be evoked through certain powerful symbols of poetry. And here, once again, he went back to a particular historical episode, the murder of Becket in the medieval period, and the play is called Murder in the Cathedral, and where his answers are, that the world will always remain enmeshed in its artificial ways, and the final outcome, which is a glorious outcome, would be possible only if the worldly ways are completely discarded, and once becomes totally free from the interests of the surroundings, and becomes a pure person. And Becket attains that kind of purity at the end, and after that it doesn't matter whether he dies or whether he lives. And in fact, Eliot is so very critical of the individual element in a human figure, that he also identifies some trait of individuality in Becket, and unless that is sorted out, Becket will not be good enough to become a medium. So poetry finally took this form that it went into drama, and it there also asserted itself as an area through which different other things will flow. So that kind of art was, combined and made into a form that Eliot represented at that point of time. So maybe we can discuss this more sometime later, but then we come to the 1930s. This period, 1917, the First War ended. After 13 years, the 30s started. And within 9 years of the 30s, in 1939 to be precise, the Second World War will begin. So it's just a question of 22 years that the Second World War will begin, and this war is going to be more destructive than the earlier one. As I said that and this war can end only when the atomic blast occurs in a distant corner of the world, and the whole world seems threatened by the prospect of annihilation. Now, in the 1930s, there is another connection with the First World War and the background that I have referred to, that is the emergence of socialist Russia. Because a dream was seen by the writers of the world at that time, and many of them turned towards rational humanism, towards planned progress. All human beings will take part as members of a community. They will plan production in such a manner that benefits of production will accrue to all people in equal terms. This kind of a dream will travel from Soviet Russia to different parts of the world. For instance, it will travel to India. It will also travel to Europe. It will also travel to France, for instance, to Germany, to Italy, to England. And a large number of the English intelligentsia started feeling inspired by the happenings in the Soviet Russia at that time, where planned economy was the new slogan and the new motto, and the whole generation came forward in the 1930s to accept the paradigm of social progress and of change, and W.H. Auden is in the forefront of this kind of poetry, which is influenced by the idea of change. It's a refreshing, change from the sense of despair and the sense of void, the sense of emptiness that we witness in T.S. Eliot's poetry, and who was a major figure in the 1920s and 30s, and that young men, now reject all that was given in the name of tradition earlier, and they would now explore new horizons. So the 1930s poets in England had Auden at their head, and there are others also like Stephen Spender, Louis MacNeice, and others. And these poets were called pink poets. Pink poets because they were not exactly red. They were not exactly committed writers, but they had a great deal of commitment in them. And since they were working from the point of view of the English middle class, so they will not be interested as much in a social revolution of the kind that happened in Russia, but then they would definitely like England to take certain principles of the Russian paradigm and put them into practice. And since that will happen at the level of the middle class, and England was a more developed and a better evolved society than Russia. Therefore, even this pink nature of their ideas, that they'll be radical and they will be rational, etc., even that will be at that time considered quite revolutionary by the English standards. So they were called the pink poets at that time, and this poetry infused a new kind of vigor into the creative endeavor of the people in England at that time. So there are a few points that I want to make about W.H. Auden here. First is that he is a voice, unlike his predecessors, he is a voice of awareness. He looks around the world, he accepts it as it is. He doesn't show any sense of judgment of that world. He wants to find out whether it has contradictions, whether it has dissensions, it has conflicts. He would recognize which conflicting forces have to be rejected and which others have to be espoused. He will do all that, and still more than this, that he is broadly aware of what is happening around him. So he will not transport himself mentally to the medieval world or to the ancient world when celebrations of a different kind occurred in nearness with nature, but he will live in his own world. He will live in England in the 1930s, and he will look at the happenings there. He will read the newspaper, whatever is covered by the newspaper. He will perhaps use that material for expression in literature. For instance, he has poems which directly refer to the Second World War. He writes in one of his poems about the day when the World War begins, and he also knows where exactly his own sympathies lie, and he's experimenting a great deal in his poetry regarding writing, at the hands of a young man who has one's eyes open and watching the incidents of the events of the Second World War and what exactly is going to happen in his mind. So he's using topical references in his poetry, which was not the case earlier. Then he refers to political happenings and events. He sometimes brings in discussions of politics in his writing, and he clearly either ridicules certain opinions which are shallow, and he shows a kind of seriousness about those opinions which are struggling to evolve themselves into full-fledged choices. He also refers to the world of capitalism, which is so very leveling, and which is so very insensitive to the individual traits of human beings, that every human being appears to be the same automaton that capitalism itself turns a human being into. For instance, that famous poem that all of us would have read or heard about, The Unknown Citizen. So this unknown citizen actually is a citizen who just follows the principles of capitalism, principles of capitalist discipline, and he has become a non-entity. He has lost his name, and he is referred to only as a particular number in the list of citizens. So his number is mentioned in the beginning, and then nobody bothers about his happiness or unhappiness. But what they bother about is that he's always carrying out the required thing, and who is dictating the requirement? That is some other force, and that force, according to W.H. Auden, is capitalism. So he brings in capitalism. He brings in the common masses. The unknown citizen is an ordinary citizen, and this person doesn't know about his own personal choices. And then Auden goes back to the heroic myths. There's a poem called The Shield of Achilles, written by him, and there he talks about the Achilles and the figure of Achilles and of other people also. And in still another poem, he talks about happenings of the old wars, and he refers to them in order to understand his own times better. So there are ways and ways to go back to the past. One way is to find only elements and equivalents of destruction, and there is another way in which if you require some heroic effort in your own time, then you go back to history, and there you identify people who at that point of time did those efforts. So you can take heroic figures as positive examples of heroism in the modern times. So this is what Auden is doing then. Then he is bringing in the simple, ordinary phrase into operation in his poetry. He sometimes uses a kind of a dialogue. Sometimes he assumes a character's tone, and in that tone he talks. And sometimes he talks in the manner of a journalist, and this is how things can be reported. So he becomes a reporter. So this sense of experimenting with poetic expression, this shows that his fertility of mind has been awakened, and this fertility will finally give a new lease of life to poetry. One thought, that in the 1920s, English poetry had more or less come to an end. It could not go any further because it entered the phase of stalemate. But no, in the 1930s and later, writers were full of verve and enthusiasm at the same time, and they had an excited imagination. They were full of enthusiasm, and they wanted to experiment with forms, with words, with expressions, and they took pleasure in criticizing trends that they considered negative trends in their time. Then most of these pink poets of the 1930s and later, they also became very sharp critics of fascism, which had shown its dangerous, ugly face in the 1920s and 30s in Italy and Germany later. And fascism, was a kind of trend in Europe at that time, which went totally against rationality, which brought in the emphasis on racialism, and one knows that all kinds of democratic opinion, all kinds of difference of opinion was attacked consistently by the fascist forces, and who thrived only on propaganda. So you repeat a lie 1,000 times, and it appears to become a truth. So that kind of thing, that with propaganda, certain races were supposed to be demonized, and finally, if you called a person bad, then you got the legitimacy about your own view, which would be that these bad people have no right to live. So this kind of fascism was there in Italy and in Germany, and certain people, of course, the pink poets attacked them. Pink poets all the time tried to engage them in a discussion about these issues, but there might have been others, who took the influence from the fascist trends at that time, and who in their own way, in their own creative way, who would be responding favorably towards this very dangerous anti-human trend. I did take just this last example today before I finish the discussion, and I talk about D.H. Lawrence as a poet. Generally, D.H. Lawrence is considered a novelist, a thinker, and he has also written in other forms, but then he has written poems. And in his poetry, and of course in his novels, one knows that he's greatly critical of capitalism. So it's you see, one doesn't become a socialist by attacking capitalism alone. One becomes a socialist only when capitalism is sought to be replaced by a different system, where the capital formation actually is used for the purposes of equitable distribution and production. That is what is socialism. But then capitalism can be attacked also from the fascist angle, in the sense that you start attacking all concepts of industry, all developments in science, and you say that science is the enemy of humanity, and industry also is the enemy of humanity, and that the source of real vigor in human beings is through their negation of human knowledge, and going back to that time when human beings were very close to nature in the form of more or less animals. So the primeval nature of human beings is evoked by D.H. Lawrence. He goes into the psyche and the imagination of people, and there he realizes that the fundamental aspect that has influenced them is the aspect of thinking. So the more you think, the more inhuman you become, in the opinion of D.H. Lawrence. And in his poetry and in his in his novels, he is attacking rationality. He is attacking industry. He is attacking science, scientific knowledge. He is attacking the values of equality, etc. And he believes that a person who is very close to nature alone is the person who will finally become a hero. And there's no wonder then that if one rejects science, philosophy, humanism, etc., then one would find himself to be supporting fascism. And in fact, D.H. Lawrence was a votary of fascism in the 1930s. So I come to the end of the discussion, and I say that, and of course, I should have gone into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, but then I know that poetry comes, so far as its journey towards progress is concerned through the century, one realizes that around the end of the Second World War, poetry really becomes weak in England. So there are poets who write regularly, but they don't emerge as representative voices there, and that the poets of the 30s, they continue writing themselves, and they also turn into some kind of mystics. Then they leave their old enthusiasm. W.H. Auden is around till the 1970s, but then he is not the same W.H. Auden. Stephen Spender, Louis MacNeice, they are not the same people that they were in the 1930s. So what happens is that poetry gets dissipated in its journey towards the later years of the 20th century, and other literary forms take over. And therefore, I would say that so far as 20th century poetry is concerned, this poetry has seen its emergence, its zenith and its climax only in the 1920s and 30s, and after that the waning of this particular form begins, and towards the end one realizes that there are no representative poetic voices, the kind of voices that were there at the time of W.B. Yeats, Eliot and Auden. So with these I tentatively finish, but if there are certain things that you want me to talk about, I can take a few minutes to.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. And we saw how sir picked up a very interesting group of poets, and each of them is very distinct in their own writing style and the ideas that they professed. And such as Yeats was a romantic, and then we saw how Eliot's was completely anti-romantic. Then Auden, who was so much in favor of experimentation and bringing about new things, and D.H. Lawrence, who attacked science, rationality. And who we generally think that he only is famous for his novels, but he is also very famous for his poetry. So, sir, as I was thinking about these poets, a question came in my mind regarding Eliot. Sir, it said that he wrote his Wasteland as a collage. Say he wrote in fragments. So is this style only typical of him, or did anybody else also borrow this style from him?
No, borrowing didn't happen, but Ezra Pound sometimes wrote like that. Eliot didn't extend this particular poetic example in other writings of his. In fact, Eliot, after 4 quartets, did not write many poems, and he also turned towards drama, and that was prose drama also. So this collage kind of arrangement that was there, actually this reflected in the early 20th century the sense of disconnect between one group and another, between one world of experience and another world of experience in the 20th century. The kind of isolation, the kind of alienation, the kind of disconnect that happened in life in general. For instance, in the early 20th century, this trend of neighbors remaining there, living in the same street and having nothing to do with one another, and that it was loneliness, that was the real value of life. These things were created consciously by certain forces in England at that time. People lost that sense of community that was there earlier. So this disconnect that is there, you call it very, very correctly, the poem with fragments. So this poetry with fragments was actually a crystallization of the life in fragments that existed in the early 20th century at that time. Okay. Later on, of course, the theatre of the absurd came, which was also fragmented in its nature. So different other literary forms, they borrowed from this fragmentary nature. And I'll maybe talk about 20th century drama, and then I'll tell you that this fragmentation can greatly help also, certain forms of literature. For instance, the heroic drama and the aesthetic of heroic drama by Bertolt Brecht. This also uses fragments to such good effect. So that can be, of course, done in a different lecture. But the point that you have raised is really significant.
Okay, thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful lecture. And we not only looked at European literature, but we also saw what was happening in India at the same time as well. So once again, I'd like to thank sir and all the listeners for being there. You could also watch this lecture on YouTube, and we'd hope to see you again. Have a nice day.